I'm Harry Spanglet. I'm the chair of the DWR Enterprise GIS Committee. And again, we started in the 90s, GIS started taking off in DWR, but it really gained some traction in the 2000s, and that's when our committee was formed. And shortly after that, we started doing GIS Day in 2008. I don't know if you know what GIS Day is. It's an annual event. It was started by Esri, the GIS company, but now it's kind of grown into this international networking event. And it provides a forum, international forum for people who use GIS to show real-world applications of the technology. So again, we started this in 2008. In 2012, it was originally just DWR. We expanded it to all of Natural Resources Agency. And again, this is our 11th consecutive year. So as you can see in our agenda, our focus this year is about tribal engagement, using GIS for tribal issues. And I will be handing it over to Anasita. Sorry, I forget your last name. Agustinas. Okay, never. A few practical matters. In your program, you will see stickers, and they are there to vote on the posters. Okay? Pick the poster you like best and put a sticker on it. Voting will happen until 1:15. At the end of the day, the poster person will win a fabulous prize, which means they get first pick out of the box of swag we got from Esri. Everyone who has a poster gets a certificate for showing they did it for professional development purposes. Please make sure you get it at the end. And again, look forward to that fabulous prize. So please, everyone, get a chance, vote on a poster. On the phone, people, you will be muted, so you can't speak. Please use the chat function. Someone's going to be monitoring that at all times. And if you can't hear or anything goes wrong, please let us know. Couple of logistics. Please, everyone, mute your cell phones. And I realize I have not muted my own. Okay. Please, no food or drink in the auditorium. That's official policy. In the event of an emergency, please use any exit. Exit the building, and then please gather in the park. There's a park. It's a structure at 8th and O. It's called the EDD Park, I guess. Please gather on the upper level of it. It's like a 2-level thing. Bathrooms are out and to the right. Women's bathroom is before you go through the metal doors. Men's bathroom is after the metal doors. At the break, we will have snacks in room 133, which you can access. Are we telling people through here? There's a door back here. Or you can go out by the bathroom and you'll see a door open there. We strongly encourage people to network. The whole point of this is talk to your fellow GIS practitioners. You know, let's all share our knowledge and enjoy ourselves while we're here. So, with that, I'm going to introduce the moderator of our first session. Is Anasita Agustinas, is a tribal citizen of the Diné or Navajo Nation. She is the tribal policy advisor at the California Department of Water Resources, where she provides policy direction regarding tribal engagement and tribal consultation in the areas of regional water planning, flood management, climate change, energy issues, drought, ecosystem restoration, sustainable groundwater management, water bond grant funding, environmental justice, and disadvantaged community engagement. Oh, spread around, aren't you? So, please welcome Anasita.
Good morning, everyone. All right. Good morning. I'll try that one more time. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. This is really a great opportunity to delve into tribal GIS. And so I really want to thank the DWR Enterprise GIS Committee for the commitment to incorporate tribal GIS in today's program. As Harry mentioned, we have been doing this for 11 years, and this is the first year on the 11th year that we're taking this deep dive, and I'm hoping that we'll see this integration and cooperation for future development in tribal GIS. The audience we targeted today is really a non-tribal audience. The purpose was really to take a look at it from an agency representative perspective of how we look at GIS today. And as you work in your own program development, then, what is lacking, what are the voids, and how we go through it. And we can just see within the last 10 years just it has been the development. So as you listen to the presentations this morning, I would like to prompt your perspectives with these questions and examples of how tribes have utilized GIS technology. And so some of these items are, how has GIS assisted tribes? What applications have been proven useful? How has GIS been used to validate indigenous knowledge and wisdom of elders and cultural keepers? And has this knowledge been properly validated through the process of oral traditional history? In the area of intellectual property, is there a danger of cultural history not remaining the property of the tribal community? So these are examples of proven use that I'd like to share that tribes have been using GIS. Roads, housing mapping, preservation of historical lands, customs and languages, economic development in agricultural use and in mineral resource development, and in the health arena. Tribes have seen success in cancer studies, in other health studies, in tribal health monitoring, which allows for tribes to access their own health data, and improves the capacity to ensure health and wellness of tribal members. Other areas of tribal GIS usage includes the monitoring impacts of global climate change on sea level rise, especially as it affects coastal indigenous communities and their ancestral land. They've also seen usage in mapping ancestral boundaries and traditional watersheds, mapping medicinal plants and collecting native plant census data, and database management of pollution sites, as well as database management of critical water infrastructure and water supplies. So I'd also like to share an example of how DWR has collaborated with tribes in exchange of data. We used the LIDAR data before and after the flood event in Oroville, which allowed the tribes to look at a 3D data for the protection and mapping of cultural resources. So a lot of our agencies already have gone deeply into GIS sharing and collaboration, but we have not been able to really coalesce this integration, the information, the sharing. So this is one of the opportunities to do that, and I'd like to see that as a focus as we move forward with cooperating with our GIS Enterprise Committee. In California, there are over 110 federally recognized tribes and approximately 70 plus tribes who are non-federally recognized. If you work for a state agency, it is incumbent upon you to be aware of each of your departments and agencies' tribal consultation policy, its practices, and its standards. The protection and information exchange of cultural resources is protected under state law. And as a state representatives, it is our collective responsibility to understand the nature of these protections and to follow the protocols of government-to-government consultation. Our state agencies have a lot to learn from our tribal partners, and I'm pleased to welcome our first presenter, Ms. Melody McAdams, representing United Auburn Indian Community. So as Melody makes her way up here, I'm going to just share a little bit about her background. So Melody McAdams has worked for the Preservation Department at the United Auburn Indian Community for 7 years. She has set up and maintained the tribe's GIS Tribal Historical Resources Information System, and which is a register of the tribe's tribal cultural resources, sacred sites, and other cultural sites. So thank you, Melody, for being here. And so our first presentation is on behalf of the United Auburn Indian Community. Thank you. Whatever's comfortable to stand or sit. We can move it for you if you like.
I don't think we can.
You won't be able to see it, though.
Oh, yeah, I can.
Okay.
I can stand over here.
See.
I brought it just in case, but I'm glad you have it.
Is this one good
Yes, it
for
is.
you? Okay.
We can get that one off.
Jane, here's the mic.
Oh, thank you, Vicki. Can I just speak into that one?
You can.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a little awkward.
Thank you.
Oh, shoot.
Thank you for that introduction, Anasita. As Anasita mentioned, I work for the United Auburn Indian Community in their Tribal Preservation Department. And so what we work with a lot is mapping and protecting the tribe's cultural heritage sites, of which there are many in California. And for a lot of GIS professionals out here, you are probably in some way involved in that environmental review process. And so hopefully my presentation will give you a little bit more insight and will help that process run more smoothly, because unfortunately, there are a lot of barriers to that happening, to protection of these places happening in the CEQA and NEPA processes. And a lot of those barriers don't need to be there, and they're just barriers of poor communication or of misunderstanding. So I'm hoping that today will help to address some of those, and if folks have questions at the end, I would love to hear them. So I'm talking about GIS data exchange and creation as part of tribal consultation in the CEQA and or NEPA processes, which if you're doing them properly should happen many times and at multiple steps. And so if you work for an agency, probably that agency is sending out GIS information to multiple tribes if you have a project about your project area. And so as part of the environmental review process, tribes receive from agencies physical hard copy maps, letters with verbal descriptions of a section, township, and range, or sometimes emails with shape files. Every tribal office is different and has different GIS capabilities. So if you're conveying GIS data to a tribe, it's good to know who you're sending it to and where you're sending it. For some people, that hard copy map is really good. For others, it's helpful to have a shape file as well. And it can really expedite the environmental review process if you're providing the right information at the right time. From a tribal perspective, when we receive GIS information, we are often hindered because the information is minimal. Sometimes it's just a verbal description, and we have to go look up your project area in our map and hope that we're guessing the right boundaries. Sometimes there are boundaries, and they're really big, like some of the boundaries you see on the wall over there, and we're like, oh wow, there are close to 1,000 sites in your boundaries. It would be nice if you showed where you had ground disturbance or what your project impacts are. When we receive project maps that show where you're doing what, we're more likely to say, okay, this is a big project area, but you're not impacting tribal cultural resources. So the more information you convey, the better, and the more helpful it is up front. So to go into a little bit of detail in the different steps in the process where tribes and agencies exchange information about location, and sometimes this involves GIS, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it involves old school on-the-ground mapping. So typically, an agency will provide geographic information to a tribe about their undertaking. And then a tribe will communicate back to that agency or consultant that that tribe does or does not have Native American sites, tribal cultural resources, sacred sites, or something similar in their project area. And then that agency takes that information and does something with it. Figures out if their project is going to impact that site and how to consider it. But there are lots of places where that process doesn't really work. And actually, to make this a bit more interactive, by a show of hands, how many of the people in the audience work for some sort of government agency? Okay, good. Making sure I'm speaking to the right audience. How many of you have prepared maps related to a CEQA or a NEPA project? How many of you have handled information from about archaeological sites or about Native American sites? Okay, good audience. I'm going to go through the environmental review process, talk about our information, talk about why it sometimes makes it to you all, sometimes it doesn't, and how to make that information sharing a bit more meaningful. I think often as GIS professionals, we're used to acquiring information, we're used to mapping with a Trimble or some sort of other GPS device. Sometimes the way that tribes convey GIS information isn't what people are used to, and that can lead to that information not really being considered as much as we'd like. So I'm here to talk about that. So obstacles to providing information to tribes. I know that often as part of the CEQA or NEPA process, you're just providing, there's an APE, there's a boundary, and you're providing that. It's very rare that we'll get more detailed maps that show what you're doing in your project area. It's really helpful if we get those. So if you're preparing those types of maps, we love to, the more detail you can include in your consultation letter, the better. And the more it helps us evaluate whether your project might impact Native American sites and what type of information we should share with you. So detail is good. For example, we have had many projects where we went out on unnecessary site visits, had unnecessary consultation meetings, where we found out that even though the APE and the project map that we were shown was 5 square miles, they just had one tiny trail that meandered through it and avoided all tribal cultural resources in the project area. So show us your map, please, your detailed map. So some of the other checkpoints are, let's say that you sent over a project area map and there are Native American sites. Oh, thank you. In your project area, what happens then? So how do you find out that there are Native American sites in your project area? From the tribe's perspective, I maintain a GIS database that has maybe 30 or 40,000 different sites within the tribe's ancestral territory. And so theoretically, I could provide a shapefile that overlapped with your project area. But it's unusual that that happens. Typically, conveying information about location happens through consultation, which is often a verbal process. So typically, because as I'm sure you're aware, working with GIS information, sometimes it's faulty, sometimes it's not completely accurate. While the tribe maintains a register of GIS data about the tribe's sites, some of that information is old, some of it is inaccurately mapped. Some of it is based on oral histories that say this site is at the confluence of these 2 creeks. So we know that if your project area overlaps with that confluence, that site is there, pointing out the physical boundaries so you can consider them as part of your project takes a little bit more work. Often it takes a site visit for us to go and look at the area and figure out what the boundaries are and what that means in terms of your project, because most people's projects have a vertical impact as well. And a lot of these sites have vertical components. So there's a bigger discussion. But one of the frustrating pieces, I think, is that often during these site visits, Native American tribes or representatives will go out and will identify a location on the ground where a tribal cultural resource or Native American site is present. Often, nobody maps that when that happens. So that is a very common missed step. So if you as a GIS professional are aware that that type of thing is, that site visits are happening, you might ask if someone would like you to go out there or make sure that there's someone out there with a mapping device. It's very frustrating to go out into the field with an agency representative to show them the location of a site or to walk the boundaries and to see that no one is out there recording. Often tribes will try and bring backup and do that recording themselves, but that's putting that professional burden on the tribe, which is really the agency's responsibility. So that's a very common misstep. Sometimes there isn't a site visit. Sometimes the tribe sends a letter saying, yes, there are these tribal cultural resources or Native American sites in your project area. And then what happens with that letter? Does that letter get transformed by the agency into a map? Very rarely. So this is another area where tribes convey GIS information to agencies and where that should lead to additional discussion. And sometimes that's difficult discussion because that information about location is vague and does require more follow-up. But that's a good reason to talk to tribes early in the environmental review process. So here I have a couple of examples of the types of maps that United Auburn provides to agencies as part of consultation. So here you can see this is a shapefile here up in the background. It's more of a heat map. So often Native American sites don't have hard boundaries and they're difficult to see. So you want to have a buffer around them and to consider where they may be and explore that boundary in more detail. Or often we'll have areas where we know, hey, there are grinding rocks along that creek. So the whole creek is sensitive for grinding rocks and we should talk about where they exist and how to avoid them if you find them in your project. And so hopefully at some point the agency is adding that information provided by tribes to their inventory of cultural sites. And that should happen through either the CEQA or the NEPA 106 process, ideally through both. Mapping information about the location of Native American sites. This is something that we do a lot, and we do it a lot with agencies. So a lot of tribal offices will, in advance, map things based on oral histories, based on data sharing agreements with the California Historical Resources Information System, which maintains a register of all of the archaeological and historic properties in the state. And we also get information from tribal monitors. So often if you have a project and there are Native American resources in the project area, tribes will request tribal monitors to protect any Native American sites through the construction process. Those monitors will, in their notes or through GPS devices, record information about the location of sites that they encounter during the construction process, and we add that to our register. So we are always adding to the register as we work through the CEQA NEPA process. Synthesizing and incorporating information about the location of Native American sites. So we've learned that the tribe always maps where sites are. Sometimes the agency doesn't, and that can lead to rough interactions as part of the CEQA NEPA process. So I encourage you, if a tribe identifies a Native American site or a tribal cultural resource or a sacred site, instead of saying, is that really there, saying, okay, let's record this. What does it mean? What are its boundaries? Sometimes figuring out the boundaries is a discursive process where you talk back and forth because boundaries change. Boundaries may depend on how deep you're digging. Many Native American sites are also archaeological sites where the deeper you go, the bigger those boundaries become. Many Native American sites have vague boundaries, and so it's good to have provisions for adjusting those boundaries as part of the construction process. So it's good to talk about what boundaries look like, how to update them, and also how to consider them for avoidance. Maybe you have a 100-foot buffer, maybe you have a 200-foot buffer. What do those boundaries mean if you're avoiding that site? Do they live in your mitigation measures? Do you have protective fencing? So boundaries are difficult to figure out, but talking about them will help you through the CEQA NEPA process, and that's kind of what it's all about. So to summarize, that was incorporating information from Native American tribes into your environmental review process. Now let's talk about identification. So let's say that you've done that, that you've met with tribes, they've given you information about those sites. Where do you put that in your CEQA NEPA process? Where do you put that in your documents? Information from tribes is confidential often. There are legal confidentiality protections. Maybe you're not even the person at your office who can legally handle that. So there are some barriers to how you treat that. But it is important that that identification actually happen and that agencies include that information from tribes so that evaluation can happen. Because, you know, while I personally think GIS is fun, and there's nothing more satisfying than writing a Python script that will automate what would have taken you 4 hours to do. We're also here because for the environmental review process, we're here to take care of our nation's heritage and culture. And that's one of the things that you do if you do your job right. Or if you don't, then things that are really important to communities don't get protected. And this is one of those really big things. So I'm going to talk about an example where, from the tribe's perspective, the evaluation process is really broken. But it can be fixed. And in California, it's starting to get fixed. So as I mentioned before, a lot of Native American sites are also treated as archaeological sites. And if a site is an archaeological site, and you're evaluating it, if it's disturbed, it lacks integrity often and is treated as ineligible for the National Register. Because the information that could be conveyed if that site were in situ can no longer be conveyed because the soil there has been disturbed, although there are still other types of information that can be conveyed. But what about from a tribe's perspective? What about what that place means to a tribe? Often that is a place of cultural heritage. It's unfortunate that it's been damaged. It would be best if it were not damaged. The tribe would really prefer typically that it not be damaged further. And so that's where evaluation is really key. So talking to tribes before assuming that something is ineligible and that it lacks integrity. Because a lot of these Native American sites that are damaged can still be repaired if treated appropriately, and the environmental review process is often a really good way to do that. There are other common assumptions that can be really problematic. For example, a common treatment for damages to archaeological sites is to excavate and curate the objects from those sites. There's actually a curation crisis where we are running out of room in our museums, which is really unfortunate because a lot of tribes have an idea of a sacredness of place, a strong tradition, which means that items belong to those places, and those places aren't whole without them. So when you take items away from those places, you damage those sites. So a very common mitigation measure for many tribal communities is actually a very significant adverse effect. And that's something that if you talk to tribes, can be communicated through the evaluation process. So instead of doing something that might further damage a site, you can talk about what avoidance and minimization and impacts and effects actually mean. And for example, a lot of the tribe's preferred mitigation measures are to preserve that integrity of location and of materials, and to ensure that anything that you do encounter is reburied. And that often involves mapping as well, because if you are reburying, it is very frustrating for what you rebury to be dug up again as part of a future project. So that involves communication with GIS professionals about what projects may be planned in the future for this location. How likely is this location to see future subsurface impacts from underground infrastructure from utilities. What's the best way to map it so that it doesn't get hit again? So geography and mapping is, if this process works, involved at every step. So I spoke a little bit about restoring integrity to disturbed sites through reburial and repatriation, but tribal monitoring is another key way through the environmental review process that tribes protect sites and also collect GIS data. So I don't know how familiar people are with the history of California. You might have heard the phrase unratified treaties. So in California, the treaties with tribes were never ratified. They were made by the federal government, but the state legislature did various things, and the treaties were kind of buried for quite some time. And so what that meant was that the large tracts of land that were supposed to be set aside as reservations never were. And most tribes in California have very small land bases, but very large ancestral territories. And so wherever you're standing, you're probably within the ancestral territory of one or often many more tribes who have lost the legal ability to access these places. So when you talk about Native American communities and historic injustices and civil rights concerns, the lack of denying legal access to these sites is huge. Often these sites are still, knowledge about these sites are maintained in tribes' oral histories. They're maintained in stories, but the ability to come out and access these sites and to steward them and to take care of them, because in most traditions it is important to do so. That happens now in part of the environmental review process, where a tribe can say, yes, I want to go out and view those sites, and I would like a tribal monitor to take care of those sites during the construction process. So that is also part of the CEQA-NEPA process, and as part of that caretaking, the tribal monitor typically gathers GIS data about what is present at that site so that the tribe can continue to steward it in the future. And that all of that information goes back, at least for UAIC, goes back to the tribe's register. So the tribe maintains a register about significant cultural sites, and that can take many different forms. That can be sites that somebody else has helpfully recorded, since the state already maintains a register of Native American sites that are labeled as archaeological sites and historic properties. That can be bigger areas from oral histories where you don't know exactly where a site is, but you know that it's along this creek, or you know it's at the top of that hill, or at this old homestead site. Or it can be information that you bring back from that site visit, where maybe the agency didn't agree with what that was, or maybe they did, but tribes still bring that back. And monitors bring that back for what they encountered on the ground at certain depths at a location. So that's why when you receive consultation letters, and the Native American Heritage Commission and various federal and state laws encourage you to check with tribes, it's because tribes typically maintain the biggest database of their own sites. That's where the motivation is. Most tribes steward their sites very carefully and put a lot of work into that. And it's really helpful if, as part of the environmental review process, you sit down and talk to tribes and figure out what that stewardship means, because often it's a little different than what folks are accustomed to. So I spoke a little bit earlier about disturbed sites and about curation and about reburial. I did want to circle back to disturbed sites and integrity, since this is an argument that I would recommend you not have as part of the CEQA or NEPA process. If you're having this argument, you're probably having the wrong discussion. If you have someone who, as part of an environmental review process, says that there is a resource or a place that is significant to them, instead of telling that member of the public or tribe or California tribe that it doesn't match certain definitions, it's more helpful to just use, the environmental review process is here to help take care of these heritage locations. So that's what you should use it for. It's not here to play gatekeeper or to figure out ways to not protect these places. Confidentiality. So this can make things more difficult. There are legal requirements for confidentiality. Looting and desecration of Native American sites is a huge issue. And for tribes, it's really difficult to provide the location of a site. Our office has provided the location of sites and found out that they were bulldozed and magically cleared through the environmental review process. Has provided the location of sites and seen them dug up by archaeologists to confirm that they were really sites when digging didn't need to happen at that location and cause damages to that site. So even though there's this idea of confidentiality and people often assume that they know what it means legally, there's more to it. And you should probably sit down and talk to tribes about what confidentiality means and how they would like their information treated and how they don't want it treated. Does confidentiality mean that when you confirm that you've mapped their sites, you just send it to that office and not to all tribes or not to the consultants? Talk to tribes and figure out what that means, because typically it's different for every tribe. So that is my presentation and my soapbox. Thank you for listening. Are there any questions?
That was awesome. That was awesome, by the way. Thank you so much for bringing that. You sure there's no questions in the audience? We do have a few minutes. Okay. Yay.
So AB 52.
Yes. AB 52 is awesome.
But it's a little confusing because, explain to me, a tribe has to in advance notify lead agencies that they wish to be notified, or they do not have to be notified. Is that correct or not? First, tell us what's AB 52.
Assembly Bill 52 modified CEQA. So I think you might have heard some embedded frustrations in my PowerPoint. So one of those frustrations is, let's say that as a Native American representative, you go out into the field and you say, this is a Native American site, it's a cultural site, it's a historic property, it should be protected in the environmental review process. The archaeologist, who you're typically, and I'm throwing archaeologists under the bus so hard here. I am an archaeologist, I have my degree in archaeology, so I'm included in this group. It's this really thoughtful look on their face and nods and says, yes, can see that it means a lot to you, but this place is disturbed, it's not in situ, it's not significant. And as a tribe, we're like, okay, here's the process. I'm out here following the process, it's not working. How do I make this work? What are the magic words? Haven't found those magic words yet, but AB 52 did change the CEQA process to say that tribal values should be considered. And so that's one of the big pieces. But that didn't answer your question, which was AB 52 did put a big burden on tribes. When United Auburn prepared to notify all of the agencies, I think there were about 700 agencies that the tribe sent letters to saying, please send the tribe AB 52 notifications. Mail merge is very helpful if you're doing that, and the Heritage Commission does very helpfully provide a spreadsheet to tribes, which you can use for that mail merge. So there is that upfront burden on tribes to send out those notification letters. The nice thing about that is that agencies talk to tribes early. Before, agencies would talk to tribes once they'd already decided on a project. So your options for avoidance didn't exist typically. which can be really frustrating because they should. You know, that's what the environmental review process is for. So I can tell you that after AB 52, you know, after the tribe had sent out all the notification letters, agencies started sending AB 52 letters to tribes early, before they'd finalized their mitigation measures, before they decided on their CEQA document. So the tribe could say, hey, this mitigation measure you have about excavating and curating any historic properties, including Native American ones, could you change that language and instead just have reburial? That was huge. You know, overnight we changed from seeing the default treatment for Native American sites be one that from the tribal perspective was desecration to one that was respectful and appropriate. And it needed to include that early inclusion requirement in the AB 52 process. So I know that it makes it harder on planners, and it's hard on tribes also because it doubled our workload. But what we found was that we fixed issues early in the environmental review process, so it started working. And so from the tribal perspective, I can say I love it. Please bear with it.
So do you find that agencies, for tribes that have not done the notifications, do they still tend to reach out to them? Or do they just do their obligation?
I think
because again, it's only if a tribe has notified an agency they wish to be informed, then they're obligated to, right?
Yes. I think that's a good question for the audience.
Okay.
Since how, you know, everyone here, most of the people here work for government agencies. Maybe raise your hand if you send an AB 52 letter, even if a tribe hasn't requested it. That's kind of a scary number. Might consider doing it. It's really, you know, a lot of tribal offices don't get funded. You know, your agencies, you have a funding mechanism. The funding mechanism for tribal offices is really limited. And you can talk with tribes early and avoid sites and make your process work and feel good sleeping at night, or you can wait till you hit something because you missed a chance to talk about it early.
Wait a second.
Hold on. Skype can't hear you.
My name is Debbie Treadway. I work for the Native American Heritage Commission, and my recommendation for every state agency, you should be sending the commission a letter asking for an AB 52 list. Even if they have not, best practices, that's what state agencies should be doing. And then we will send you the list, and then you should be contacting.
Thank you. I was hoping, oh, good.
One more question. Thank you.
For those of us who are not in the environmental review process, can you please define CEQA and NEPA so we know what you're referring to?
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Sorry to be throwing out the acronyms so much. So CEQA is a state law. It is the California Environmental Quality Act. And it was recently, a few years ago, modified by Assembly Bill 52, which added a lot of tribal values and requirements for consultation with Native American tribes. As you can imagine, tribes did not go to the effort of introducing new legislation because the process was working for Native American sites. People did that because it wasn't working for Native American sites. But while AB 52 still has some hiccups and does put a lot of burden on tribes to reach out and to be involved in the consultation process, it does have the opportunity for a lot more protections. There are also federal requirements. The federal piece is kind of weird. NEPA and 106 are kind of split in odd ways. So Section 106 is related to the National Historic Preservation Act. And sorry, I really should have brought my water bottle. Oh, thank you. So it mirrors CEQA. In the past, prior to the passage of AB 52, We often felt that the federal protections, thank you so much, were stronger. After AB 52, our tribe has felt, sorry, I should clarify, I work for the tribe, I'm not a tribal member. The tribe has felt that, that CEQA is often stronger. And so we'll often push more on the CEQA, on the state law side, to include protections in the mitigation measures. Sometimes you'll have a project that is just federal or just state. It's more common to see smaller CEQA-only projects, especially with smaller city or county agencies. So a lot of tribal offices are more used to CEQA, and if you're not a if you don't work for a federal agency, you're probably more used to CEQA. And even if you do work for a federal agency, you're probably at least used to working around CEQA. Did that kind of answer the question? And there are a lot of specific requirements for mapping as part of those laws.
Thank you, Melody, and thank you for those questions from our audience. I just want to also acknowledge that part of our panel discussion, if you have more questions, especially as it relates to AB 52, we have our technical resources here represented by Native American Heritage Commission. So we'll invite one of the representatives, I think it's Rob, that will join us on our panel. So if there's more information needed, more detail on that, we'll be able to look at that issue. Our next speaker is Mr. John Mosley. And John Mosley is a member of the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe. He is also Lakota, Mono Walker River Paiute, and Fort Peck Assiniboine. He works as a natural resource specialist, as a regional GIS coordinator for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Pacific Regional Office here, that's in Sacramento, covering the state of California in Sacramento, California, and he's worked for the Pyramid Lake Paiute and Yarrington Paiute tribes as their environmental director. He also has worked with USDA as a soil scientist. So, Mr. John Mosley, please join us.
All right, I'll use the handheld because I might wander a little bit. That way the Skype people can hear. So yeah, I work for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is a part of the U.S. Department of the Interior. So I'm going to talk about our Indian lands GIS data. And you might notice in the outline that it says tribal GIS data. So I wanted to I thought that was a good discrepancy to illuminate the difference between Indian lands versus tribal lands, of which we have Indian lands in California. So we say Indian lands because, and we say the word Indian because we're Indian Affairs, but Indian lands because the way lands were allotted to tribes and Indians, some lands were allotted just specifically to tribes as a tribal nation or tribal government or a band or some kind of organized tribe, versus some lands were issued through the Allotment Act or through homesteads to individual Indians, which were not under a jurisdiction of a tribe. So I just wanted to present on our data and our information because it gets into some technicalities that maybe most people would not understand. Either federal or state governments or counties or pretty much anyone would really not understand some of our idiosyncrasies of our data, so I wanted to go over it. I'm hoping I got the notice from Jane about making sure my presentation was large enough, so I hope people can see it in the back. But I'm going to talk about just kind of an overview of our data set. It's pretty dry and boring. I'll try to make it interesting. So our data set was kind of created in different ways through different sources, starting in the early 2000s. And that's when the U.S. Department of the Interior got on board with getting enterprise license agreements with ESRI and started developing GIS. One of the things we do as a federal agency is we provide the enterprise license agreement and extend that out to tribal governments. So all federally recognized tribal governments are able to access an ESRI license and get GIS for no charge to them, as just a service that we provide. Also, we provide training, free training through the license agreement through our branch of geospatial support. So as we started endeavoring to create data in the state of California and in our region, we worked closely with our Lands and Title Realty Office, which is basically, for people that don't understand what that is, where we record title for land in the federal government for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So Indian Land has its own title recording office that's separate from the county recording office and really independent of each other, although we encourage use of both so that so we don't have any issues between us both and title is not clouded. But when we accept land into trust, we record it at basically our own recording office. And we call it the LTRO. The LTRO office, it covers a lot more than just recording land title. We pretty much do everything there in terms of realty functions. So we would record individual deeds, we record right-of-ways. So oftentimes people have to record both things. Like if you have a right-of-way, you have to record it in the county and record it in our LTRO. So working with our LTRO, we set forth, endeavored to create a comprehensive data set that represents most of our trust land. Now, I'll get into the details of that later. We also try to create boundaries, and the boundary files are a little bit harder to explain. I'll try to get it in 20 minutes. Our data, in the way this was created, our data was meant to be internal. It wasn't meant to be an external product. But right now, I treat it as an external product for anybody that's interested. But some of the attributes of our data are land area code, which is what we use to differentiate tribal governments and tribal land bases or Indian land bases. Indian land bases are under the public domain allotments, so they have their own separate number that's not associated with the tribe. So we have tribal trust. We have data that has agency offices. The agency offices are essentially like local jurisdiction offices at a local level within our region that provide direct services, or used to provide direct services at one time to the tribes. Mostly a lot of the services we provide now are realty services. Our data has county information. We have tract status, tract ID, tribe name, county. Under the TR status field, or the tract status, I think that's the important one to hit on. We have several types of status of land. The most common one people might know is tribal trust. So when land goes into trust, it's under the ownership of a tribe, and you know what that is. We have tribal allotment. So under the Allotment Act, individual Indians within a reservation or that were part of a tribe were able to apply for allotments within the reservation, which took away the land base from just being owned by the tribe and under the purview of the tribal government. and assign some ownership of land to individual Indians in the form of an allotment, which may be like 2.5 acres, 5 acres, 10 acres, using some kind of aliquot description. And also, we have our other types of data are government lots, which we have a Bureau of Indian Education school in the state of California that is on a government lot. Some lots are lands that we've acquired as BIA, which we intend to give to a tribe that is seeking federal recognition through the Office of Federal Recognition, but hasn't quite made it there. But we just set aside land. So right now they're attributed as government lots. And we have public domain allotments. And so public domain allotments were created under the Allotment Act. They are allotments under the public domain, which some people confuse that to mean that they're not Indian lands, or they discount them as being in trust. But public domain allotments are definitely in trust. Instead of having a tribal government to deal with, you would deal with the Bureau of Indian Affairs directly. Some tribes may have some kind of strong connection or affiliation to those public domain allotments. So those trust lands might have individual Indians that are also members of their tribe that are adjacent or close in the proximity or in their historical land area, their heritage area. So they might have a lot to say about what goes on in the public domain allotments. And we also have mineral tracts. And the mineral tracts or mineral allotments, those might have been public domain allotments or tribal allotments that the surface rights have been sold or conveyed or they've lost their trust status, but the mineral rights have been preserved. So those are fairly common as well. There's tribal reserve tracts, which is basically land that was reserved by the United States to give to tribes. It's just another form of title, and we treat it the same as trust land. And also with restricted fee lands were lands that may have been acquired by the United States. They may have been acquired by an individual Indian, but with the United States acting on their behalf with funds from that individual Indian's like individual money account. So a long time ago, individual Indians were not considered citizens of the United States. So the United States kept an account of their funds on their behalf, and if they wanted to purchase lands out of that account, under our authority, that land would come into trust, or it would have the title would have a restriction added into the title document on the deed. So that deed with that restriction says that the land can't be alienated or encumbered without the approval or extinguished without the explicit approval of the Secretary of the Interior. So that kind of strongly worded restriction essentially puts the land in trust to the United States because nothing can be done without the United States approval. And then finally we have fee simple land, which is land that may be acquired by a tribe. It could have gone out of trust within the tribal boundary, or it could be in the public domain. It could be a partial interest in an allotment, which I'm not going to get into the weeds on that, but land ownership for Indians can be subdivided, but not based on acreage. It's based on an interest. So an interest might be like, 1/2 of an interest would be owned by one person and another half would be owned by another person. By now, since the way the title was structured, we have some interests that are in the millionths of ownership. So if a person with a millionth ownership gets some kind of like royalty for oil, they might get pennies on the dollar, or if that, depending on what the payout is. And we have unrecorded land. And unrecorded land is something that I try to introduce into our data set, basically because there's a little bit of a lag in our process, in that when we accept land into trust as the United States, as our regional director on behalf of the Secretary of Interior, who has that authority conveyed, when we take land into trust and accept it, that process has to go through some other finalities, which include being recorded in our LTRO. So it has to kind of go. We might accept the land, and then the recordation in making the land official in the system will take maybe 6 months. It could take a year. So unrecorded simply means that we've accepted land into trust. It is within the federal ownership on behalf of a tribe or an individual Indian, but it hasn't yet been recorded. So I just wanted to capture that that federal recognition, even though it hasn't essentially been made completely final. It's still in trust. The data set is updated annually or semi-annually by myself, if I can find time. I have a lot of other hats that I wear in my job. The way our data has been established is through individual data sets for a tribe mostly, and then for the public domain allotments, the Indian lands, they're created as one big file geodatabase. And we use a model and model builder to aggregate the data and append them together into one published database. So we we send that data to our branch of geospatial support, and the branch of geospatial support in BIA is kind of an important group to us because they're the ones that kind of publish our national authorized data set. So I give our data that I take care of on our side, I submit that to them and let them kind of go through it and decide what they want to keep, and then they publish a national data set they call the LAR, or it's a land area representation data set. And then when that land area representation data set is published, that is BIA's authoritative data set that we publish. And I don't know, I think it's been recently published, or it's about to be published on a national level. One thing I don't like about the LARB, it doesn't get into the nitty-gritty details of the status of the tracts that are near and dear to my heart anyways, as a data person. The land area representation is going to be larger scale, so it's just going to be the outside of boundaries of what's in trust. So trust land, I just wanted to explain a little bit about trust land because most people probably don't understand what land being in trust is. So trust land evolved through case law, through the Supreme Court. The first really big case that kind of set the tone was Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823. Basically, a family under the name Johnson, they acquired land from a tribe. The tribe sold them land, and they homesteaded and lived on the land for about 80 years. So the descendants of Johnson, they were notified by a new family by the name McIntosh that the land was no longer theirs, or it wasn't theirs at all. It was patented and deeded by the United States, so that was their homestead. And because of that conflict, going through legal process, it made its way to the Supreme Court to decide. And the Supreme Court decided that because tribes were not legally legally capable of owning land because of the doctrine of discovery that the United States can only be the ones that deed land to individuals. So Macintosh won the land. But in doing so, it kind of undermined a little bit of some tribal sovereignty. The doctrine of discovery is not even it's not even a legal instrument of the United States. It was issued by the Pope. So the Pope issued this discovery doctrine in the Treaty of Tordesillas, and said that only non-Christian or any non-Christian lands, any lands that are occupied by pagans or heathens, they couldn't be owners of the land. Only Christians and Christian nations in good standing could discover lands and keep them. So based on that discovery of the land in the United States, that the Indians could not own the land and have title to it. But that created a lot of issues because at that time, by that time, Indians had already undergone treaties with the United States, and there's promises and agreements made. There's a lot of things that were done. So it created a little bit of a conundrum, as further evidenced in the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. So in that case, the Cherokee Nation felt that the state was a little too cumbersome for them, kind of undermining their rights. And again, the Supreme Court said that, based on Johnson versus McIntosh, they don't have as many rights as they should. And I'm probably butchering that case, but basically they established that tribes were domestic dependent nations. So we recognize that they're nations. They have treaties with the United States, but they are dependent on the United States as well now. So we recognize they're a nation, but they're dependent on the United States. So it creates kind of like a trustee and beneficiary relationship with the tribes. The United States being the trustee, acting kind of as a guardian for the tribes, and then the tribes being the beneficiaries to the United States. In fact, the Indians weren't considered citizens of the United States until 1924 under the Indian Citizenship Act. So my grandfather was born as not really a citizen of the United States. It's kind of weird to think about. But Indians were recognized as citizens because they fought in World War I on behalf of the United States. Even though they weren't citizens, it was still in Indian land, so they fought on behalf of the United States, and they couldn't be recognized for their valor in their war efforts. And finally, Congress said they have to change the law and make it official that Indians could be citizens. They weren't really considered citizens because they were individual nations, and as a citizen of that nation, they couldn't be a citizen of the United States or have dual citizenship. So that was the logic back then. But all these cases and others that kind of continue to be upheld, I think the most recent ruling, it was in 2006, upholds the doctrine of discovery and basically restricts land ownership for Indians. But, I mean, as bad as it sounds, there's a lot of benefits now to trust land that the United States tries to uphold and let the tribes enact their sovereignty through that federal protection. So we think of it more as protection now, and we don't act as the trustee to award. We don't try not to have that paternalistic relationship. Other federal laws like the Indian Self-Determination Act, that helps give tribes more sovereignty and make more decisions on behalf of the United States. So our data set, it mainly deals with trust lands, whereas Melody was talking about the outside other lands and the interest of tribes. We kind of focus our narrow scope within trust lands. A lot of our NEPA work is for projects that the tribe is wanting and directly involved in. So our work is a little bit easier that way because we're working with the tribe to do that project. So I wanted to do a little bit of a breakdown of Indian lands. I kind of talked about Indian land versus tribal land. Indian land is all-inclusive of trust lands. And tribal land would be under the jurisdiction of a tribal government. Tribal governments were recognized in the Indian Reorganization Act officially, but before that, tribal governments were recognized through treaty. Land that's in trust is in ownership of the United States, but it's on behalf of a federally recognized tribe or an individual Indian. So that ownership by the United States, the United States doesn't treat it as this is all public land, and it's kind of treated as private land, but it's under that federal protection. We don't try to restrict tribes in whatever they need to do within the land because we're the owners. Individual Indian-owned land. So typically those are going to be allotments. You don't see Indian-owned land in tribal trust. There's allotments under the tribal jurisdiction, but there's still allotments. Those include, I talked about the PDAs. Homesteads were common. A homestead would have been issued to someone because they wanted to, have a ranch and, get 160 acres. So they were allowed that privilege, just like anybody else was, to kind of make a home for themselves. And then sometimes I talked about this as restricted fee land. Again, that's when the United States would purchase land out of maybe an individual Indian money account, and buy land in title, and the title would go to the United States, or would have the restriction on the title deed. The tribal land, it's mostly going to be reservations or rancherias. Sometimes we have colonies. There's different names, like a tribal reserve, which is basically a reservation. In California, there were reservations established, through executive order or through act of Congress, through treaty. Well, not through treaty necessarily here, but in other areas they were established through treaty. Rancherias were created under the Rancheria Act, and rancherias were created because the treaties that weren't ratified in California, the Indians that were in California didn't have a home, so because of the homeless Indians, they set aside parcels of land and finally kind of recognized that there's Indians in California instead of ignoring them and ignoring the treaties. And the United States, the Commissioner of the Interior at that time, sent out a commission to the Smiley Commission, which went around California and looked at where individual Indians or where communities of Indians were living, and then gave them land based on that, where they were. So if you hear of a reservation, if you think about that tribe that's on that reservation or that rancheria, that was the land that was given to them because the United States said there was people living there. That doesn't mean that was their actual ancestral homeland. It just happens to be the parcel of land they were given. Another nuance to that, and I know this because I'm many different tribes, but sometimes when the United States recognized Indians on a reservation or on a rancheria, the person that was there may not be from that tribe, but because they were there at that time, they got on the census rolls, and that made them eligible to be a member of that tribe. But that they might not have any tribal affiliation whatsoever. I know this because my great grandfather was from Bishop. He's Bishop Paiute, but he moved to Walker River in Nevada, and he became like one of the first tribal chairmen under the Indian Reorganization Act at Walker River. Even though he's not Walker River Paiute, he's Bishop Paiute. But because he lived in Walker River at the time, he got on the census rolls, he became Walker River Paiute. But there was a lot of Indian services back in Schurz in Walker River, and that's why he moved. And Indians in California were considered homeless at that time, so they didn't have a reservation to go to. In the Owens Valley, it wasn't until 1934 that the United States even recognized the tribes as actual tribal governments. Before that, they were just, homeless Indians in Owens Valley. That's a whole nother discussion on the Owens Valley tribes. I'm not going to go there. Another definition we have is Indian country, and I've seen the state use this definition, but that's all. I mean, it's kind of an all-inclusive description of the different various lands that I've described in my data set. But basically, most Indian-owned or reservation lands in the United States, but then it could include some ancestral lands. The example I have of including ancestral lands would be like the Pitt River tribe or tribes. Pitt River is they're considered a tribal government, but there's really 11 bands, and I think there's even more sub-tribes. I'm not going to try to describe them, but they have a ancestral square that they use of all of their different bands that they have within that square of their homelands. And the Pitt River tribe as the government doesn't necessarily represent those individual homesteads. And we have reservations and rancherias that were created, like Likely Rancheria. It's the smallest rancheria in the United States. It has its own land area code, but it's under the jurisdiction of the Pitt River tribe. But it was it was recognized as an individual Indian land or tribal land at that time when it was created. So lots of different interesting nuances you can learn in Indian land. But Indian country is the all-inclusive term. So I decided to go into reservation boundaries. I don't know how am I doing on time? I didn't. 5 minutes. Okay. This is very important. Sure. And then we'll go straight to a break. Okay, sorry. I'll try to go faster. But so, a reservation boundary, again, those are lands that were reserved by the United States. They're established by treaty and federal statute, executive order. We now have a process that for lands that have been recently taken in trust to go through a federal recognition process. So the lands that were considered off reservation before now can be considered reservation, and that goes to the Federal Register. Rincon is the most recent tribe that went through that process. But generally, I skipped my first point. Generally, we say the reservation, and we mean any trust land. That's a general way people speak, either federal or I've seen it in state. We say tribe's reservation, and reservation is kind of a tenuous word because if you look at what is legally constitutes a reservation, it has to be established by treaty, the statute, executive order, or have gone through a federal recognition process. So I don't really keep data on boundaries, although we've tried to, because it involves a legal process, a legal review, which that goes beyond my capacity. Although I can do a little bit of legal review, I'm not a lawyer, so I won't pretend to say I can, with authority, establish what a reservation boundary is. There's so many acts of Congress that you have to review, and possible treaties, federal statutes. Reservation boundaries have changed and evolved. For example, a tribe may have gained land through an executive order. And I've seen this before, the evolution of it. The executive order may have reserved a larger section of land than what actually is in the reservation boundary now. And the reservation boundary now that would have been established finally through like a federal statute, an act of Congress would have omitted some lands that were previously included in the executive order by the president. So you have to go through a careful legal review of all those documents to see what the end product was. So off-reservation trust land, those are a lot of fee to trust lands, where a tribe may have acquired land in fee as they can. They would own they would own that land at that time when they take ownership of it. It would still be in the more of the public domain though, and then they can go through a process with the United States through through BIA to put that land into trust. So and then when the land goes into trust, it's considered off reservation because it's not under that. It's not established through those other mechanisms I talked about before. A lot of tribes now are getting savvy to the processes, and as they go through the fee to trust process, they're concurrently going to go through the federal recognition process of their land to become part of the reservation, which they can do concurrently. Just some lessons learned on taking land into trust. So not all tribes may have a reservation. There's the dependent Indian communities, which I think that refers to Alaska Native communities and corporations. There's tribes in California, like the Tohono tribe in California does not have any land or a reservation within the state, but they are a federally recognized tribe. There's tribes like the Karuk, which are formerly the Upper Klamath tribes that didn't get land until 1977, but they were recognized as a tribe. So federally recognizing a tribe versus if they really own land or not, that's something that needs to be understood. There was a termination process in California. If you haven't really educated yourself on that, I would learn that what happened in California. I noticed in the card, I forget what it's called. I picked this up. The culture card, they talk about a lot of how many, like hundreds of tribes that were terminated. And most of those tribes were actually in California, a good number of them, I think about 40, but don't quote me on the actual number, but a large number of those tribes were in California that were terminated, meaning the tribal government agreed with the United States, and I don't know all the circumstances, but basically we said that we no longer need a tribal government. The individual Indians can be individual Indians and live on their own. And the United States made several promises for them to be able to do that, and did not necessarily live up to those promises, which ended up in court, of course. And based on the decision of the court and the breach of trust by the United States, the court reissued tribal reservation boundaries. So we have some tribes that have a reservation boundary, but they don't own any land. They may not own any land or have any land in trust within the boundary. So that's not uncommon. That's why I haven't created a real boundary data set, because it's a cumbersome process to consider all the legal aspects of what is actually a boundary. I guess another way you can establish a boundary that I didn't include is by a court case, the decision of a court. I'm not going to go into land title. It's probably too cumbersome to go into. I don't have enough time. Besides, I kind of covered a little bit of title. So I'll leave it to any questions. Here's my contact information if there's any questions. And for general questions and inquiry on GIS-related things, you can contact geospatial@bia.gov, and they can answer. But if you want a more local answer, you can contact me. Thank you.
John, that was really a great presentation. I'm sorry about the timing. We will have John back on the panel. So regarding the complicated nature of Indian lands, that is really very interesting. And to hear it, as you laid out, we grapple with that all the time as state agencies. The other thing, information you presented, it prompted me, was reservation and about California history, and that your organization, BIA, under the Department of Interior, was actually under the Department of War. and that's when a lot of these policies were started. And when we think of reservations, majority of that was set aside for military reservations. So we have to look at that in terms of, it wasn't a place for Indians to live, it was a place for Indians to be put aside, as you would think of as a military reserve. So that is California Indian history, as well as across Indian country. We're going to take a break, and then we're going to have two more presentations, and then start with a panel discussion. So feel free to take a break and come through this way or go out through the front door. But thank you.